Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final review of the new Sigma 16mm f1.4. This is a DC DN lens. It is for mirrorless systems, including Sony E-mount, where I'm reviewing it today, and also Micro Four Thirds. Now, this lens bears Sigma's contemporary mark, and the explanation that I've been receiving for this, that while it looks like an art lens in terms of the build and design, and of course the fact that it's a very large maximum aperture lens, is that the contemporary designation comes from the fact that the end product of the image quality, and that includes things like distortion and chromatic aberration and other aspects, vignette like that, that the end product is not, it's not all the internal correction of the lens elements in the optical formula, but it relies in part on the embedded profile, either in a Sony or a Micro Four Thirds body, to kind of complete the picture. And so, as a result of that, it bears the contemporary in that, the assumption is that an art lens is going to have most of those things corrected for kind of natively within the lens itself. Now, of course, my experience says that almost no lens executes that perfectly, and I've yet to see an art lens that corrects for all of those things perfectly either. But I think I understand the logic behind that this lens is somewhat of a hybrid of optical technology and then as well as some electronic technology in terms of delivering the end product. But of course, I think what matters for most of us is going to be that end product. And thanks to the fact that Sony does allow for third-party profiles to be embedded in its cameras, it means that as a result, whether you're shooting JPEGs or if you're bringing the RAW file into a RAW converter, like an Adobe product, for example, I find that already the profile is there along with the RAW file. You don't have to wait for Adobe to add that. It's already embedded there in the RAW file, and so it's easy to apply that and thus get the end result. And so in some ways, you have to do more work to see an uncorrected result than you do to see the corrected result. And so if you didn't tune in before for our image quality segment, I would encourage you to take a look at that here, where I break that kind of image quality and the end result down in more detail. But first of all, here, let's take a quick look at the build quality and the design of this particular lens. As noted in my first episode here, you can check out a more detail about that. This lens, of course, is on the larger side of lenses that are native for Sony's APS-C. But it also, of course, is a large aperture wide angle lens, which are somewhat notoriously difficult to engineer. And so in this case, it corresponds to a full frame equivalent with Sony's 1.5 times crop factor of the classic 24mm focal length. And so, wide without being extremely wide. In some ways, I think within the sweet spot where I would say from about 18mm to 24mm, that is kind of optical for a lot of landscape photography. If you go wider than that, it really takes some creativity and composition, and it's more about emphasizing detail than it is necessarily capturing a scene in a classical sense. And so as a result, I think this is a focal length that a lot of people will find very useful. And of course, it has a maximum aperture that a lot of people will find very useful. Now, on the note of that very large maximum aperture of f1.4, I do want to add that I find in my personal experience that wide aperture in some ways is even more important on APS-C, which this lens is designed for, than it is on a full frame, for a couple of reasons. Number one, to this point, there aren't any APS-C bodies that I've ever used, including the Sony a6500 that I'm doing the review on, that I find does as well at higher ISOs as equivalent full-frame bodies. The pixels become a little bit more obvious, the noise is a little louder, and as a result, I just don't like, at least at a pixel level, I don't like the end result as well. So the good news about having a large maximum aperture is it gives you some options, and that you might be able to keep that ISO level down and thus keep your noise level and kind of the size of the pixel down a little bit to where it's less obvious, giving you a cleaner end result. That's certainly a plus. The other plus is, of course, is that with APS-C, it's harder to achieve that very narrow depth of field look, kind of what was often referred to as the full frame look. And so having a large maximum aperture also helps to give you some options with that. And so I do want to praise Sigma for kind of the engineering that went into producing a lens like this that has a large maximum aperture along with a wide focal length. Now, as a plus for the series and the first of any of Sigma's mirrorless lenses, it does have a gasket here and some internal sealing to provide some moisture and splash resistance. And so while, probably not the most robust weather sealing you've ever seen, the inclusion of some certainly makes a difference. And the build itself is very nice. The lens feels sturdy. And as I related in an earlier episode, with another copy of this lens that was a loaner, this is actually my own. Gives you to kind of jump ahead to the end. I liked it enough that I bought it. But my loaner copy that I had while shooting a wedding, my camera came off the harness system and literally bounced down a wooden staircase. Boom, boom, boom. And everybody is, wedding party and people that are observing are all, as it bounces, and it's like that slow motion, conk, 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 all the way down. And so I was like, oh no. And I went and inspected, and the lens hood had kind of gotten pushed off, but I was able to put that back on, and I looked the lens over. And other than a little mark on the lens hood, it survived that encounter just fine. And when I tested later, it seemed to still be centered fine. And so kudos to Sigma. I think that, unfortunately, I don't like to torture test build. I did in this case. It held up, and so good for them. Up front, it's a 6-7 millimeter filter thread, and you can use traditional filters. Certainly also a plus there. It's a common size, and being able to use typical screw-in filters just extends the usefulness of a lens like this. There are no switches on there. There's no OSS built into it. In my case, I'm using it with a Sony A6500, which has the built-in body image stabilization. And so that's a plus there, if you have a body like that. And so as far as the build goes, this is one of the nicest APS-C, lenses designed for Sony E-mount that I've used. So nothing to complain about there. It's a very nice lens. Now, optically, going back to the optics for a moment, you'll discover that it's very usable even from f1.4. Center sharpness being ahead of corner sharpness, but corner sharpness not being terrible. There is quite a big difference between f1.4 and f2 when it comes to the contrast from the lens, as there is some axial or longitudinal chromatic aberration at f1.4 that clears up nicely by f2. And so as the byproduct of that, your image quality is sharper at f2. That's not to say that f1.4 is not usable, and it's very usable, but if you're looking for a higher contrast image, you definitely get a better result at f2 than you do at f1.4. As you stop the lens on down, you get improved image quality. I'm talking kind of extreme edge image quality, and probably peaking at around f5.6, and so you get the kind of the most even result between center and edge performance by about that. In terms of other attributes, the lens is very, very flare resistant. It does an excellent job with that. At aperture smaller than f2, chromatic aberration is very nicely taken care of. Distortion exists. There is some moderate barrel distortion. However, in the end product of what you're going to see after the profile is applied, it clears up quite nicely and lines become quite straight. And so, it's really not an issue in the end result that you're going to see. There is some vignette at wide apertures, but again, because of that correction, it corrects easily, and so it doesn't seem to be destructive to the end product, and so not a huge issue there either. Is going beyond that, color rendition seems to be good from the lens, and I'm happy with what's coming out of it. The bokeh or bokeh quality, if you get close to your subject, is really, quite decent. Now, if you do have bright highlights and you can actually magnify the image enough to see them, there is a little bit of concentric circles or onion bokeh look in there, but it's not pronounced enough with such a wide focal length that you're hardly ever going to see. So I consider that to really be somewhat of a non-issue. And for example, in this photo of a staircase with the rails going out of focus, I feel like the bokeh quality is really quite decent there. And so that is also, I would consider, an N+. As far as the chroma performance, I've yet to see a Sigma lens that has a perfect chroma performance, but and this lens doesn't change that. At f1.4, you definitely will see the stars they grow wings and look a little bit like buzzing insects towards the very edges of the frame. And stopping down to f2 makes an improvement there. And so, I think it's usable for shooting night sky work, and I'll use it for some astro work, but note that it's not at the absolute best when it comes to that either. Now, some very, very positives in this comes to the actual focus quality. The lens focuses very quietly, it focuses very quickly, and it focuses accurately. And so a lot of pluses there. It behaves very nicely for with all of the different protocols with the Sony body. IAF works well. It does provide good video servo AF and face tracking in video. I have found in a few more challenging, maybe backlit situations, that focus will waver a little bit. But at the same time, I haven't yet seen anything on my Sony systems that corresponds as well to what Canon's DPAF does on the Canon side. And so part of that is also due to the nature that Sony's face tracking for video AF isn't top notch, or at least not as good as what Canon's is. But out of the Sigma lenses that I have used, which I've used all of their mirrorless lenses, I would consider this to be the best of the bunch. And on the note of video, it's a very good video lens for a couple of reasons. You can either use the native 24 millimeter equivalent focal length, or you can shoot it in Super 35, where it's still a very useful focal length. I think that people that do vlogs or people that do video production in general are going to enjoy this lens because the video AF, it doesn't do a lot of hunting, and so it's fairly solid there. But also the lens is very sharp. And also it's a great focal length, and so it delivers very good results. So, to wrap things up, this lens, I believe, has a lot of things going for it. It's a nicely built lens. It's a reasonably priced lens. And, particularly when you consider some of the cost of some of the either Sony branded lenses or the Zeiss 2It series, this lens has a very attractive price tag of around $449 in the US market. And while that is the most expensive of any of Sigma's offerings for mirrorless, it's, in the big scheme of things, that's a reasonably priced lens, particularly when you consider what it is: a wide aperture, very wide aperture, and wide angle lens. And so I don't know that there is any wide angle lens that has more going for it on Sony's E-mount APS-C than what this lens does. And so it's easy for me to give it a recommendation. In fact, I gave it the highest recommendation I can. I bought it for myself. I eliminated the Sigma 19 millimeter f2.8 from my kit. I added this 16 millimeter f1.4 instead. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find a couple of things there. You can find an image gallery that I've uploaded a lot of different images to that I think will help you to evaluate the actual performance for yourself. You can also find a link to my full written review on my website, and I know that some of you do prefer written or text reviews, just for the nature of them. You'll find linkage to that there. There's also buying linkage if you would like to purchase one for yourself. And of course, as always, you can follow me there on social media or become one of my patrons. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.